I mean, it's a good problem to have.
No, yeah, but still.
It's still a lot of work, yeah. Checking if everything is silent. Yes, yes, yes.
Ok, iniziamo. Welcome. Before leaving the floor to Professor Forti for the presentation of the event and the speakers, I would like to say a few words in Italian about the Students Forum which organized the event. E come alcuni di voi sapranno, il forum studentesco della Normale, insomma, è un'associazione di studenti che si occupa di organizzare eventi simili a quello di oggi su temi di attualità che ci piace discutere con personaggi, diciamo, accademici e non. E oggi siamo qui per parlare del tema del consenso in una prospettiva femminista, a partire soprattutto dal libro di Manon Garcia, Di cosa parliamo quando parliamo di consenso. E, tra l'altro mi piace ricordare che ieri alla libreria Tra le righe, quindi a 2 passi da qui, è stato presentato in realtà il primo libro che Manon ha scritto, in traduzione italiana uscito ieri, quindi no, che esce il 22, in realtà è stata una pre-presentazione, Sottomesse non si nasce, lo si diventa. So we're glad to have you here and I leave the floor to Professor Forti.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Great, yeah. Yes, yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm really sorry that I have to introduce Manon Garcia from here, and as Victoria, Octavia just said, we are really glad to that she's visiting us to talk about her book, her previous book, and her research in general. Manon Garcia is a French philosopher. She graduated at the École Normale in Paris, and then she taught in Harvard and Chicago University, and now she is teaching at the Freie Universität in Berlin. So I don't want to say much before having listened to Manon, and then maybe say something else at the end. We just remember that Manon wrote a book, the book that is coming out in Italian now, and is We Are Not Born Submissive, How Patriarchy Shapes Women's Lives. And the book that came out recently, The Joy of Consent, A Philosophy of Good Sex, translated in many languages, and that has been published by Einaudi di Torino. Please, I will enjoy your talk.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me today. Here, I need to speak more there. Okay. Yeah, tell me.
Può silenziare l'audio, professoressa?
Io?
Grazie. Sì.
Subito.
Okay, so now it seems to be working better. So thank you very much for having me here today. I am particularly grateful to Ottavia and Marco for organizing this, but also to Professor Forti and Carlotta and Federica, who have taken the time to read my work, and I'm very grateful. I'm particularly honored to be here because a long time ago I spent 2 months here at La Normale as an exchange student, and I keep very fond memories of my time here, working until very late at night in the upper level of the library here. And actually, some of the things I wrote at the time are in the consent book. So there's a sort of consistency of me being here. So today, Ottavia and Marco have decided to call our discussion The Limits of Consent, Feminist Perspective. So I will talk about several worries that as feminists we can and maybe should have with the vocabulary of consent. And I will briefly sketch my response to them, but I think with Carlota and Federica we're also going to have more of a conversation because it's also more interesting for you to hear us talk than just to listen to me talk for and less long time. So I will focus mostly on sexual consent, and you will have time to ask us questions later on, and we can enlarge the conversation and broaden it to include consent in general. So I would like to start with an expression of surprise, because why are we talking about the limits of consent from a feminist perspective? Like, isn't it that women are the ones pushing for talking about consent all the time? So this is kind of what we hear, right? All the time, oh yeah, it's women, they're preventing us from having sex the way we used to, now we need to care about consent, etc. So not only are we forcing everyone to talk about consent, but now we're talking about what is wrong with consent. So I understand that this is a bit surprising. So I would like first to say a few words about why consent matters so much for feminism. Because consent is a word that comes from legal vocabulary and that is at the heart of liberalism. And feminism and liberalism share an emphasis on autonomy, both personal and political. As an important liberal feminist, Anne Phillips note, the freedom to decide for oneself is both an aspiration and a concern for feminists. Feminists want to break with centuries of dependence and submission, during which women have been compelled to accept husbands chosen by their fathers, so they didn't have a say, they couldn't really consent to who they were marrying, to follow religious injunctions about appropriate forms of sexuality and motherhood, to obey paternalistic legislation claiming to protect them from their own fragility, etc. And so feminists have repeatedly made self-determination the condition for women's liberation. And the fact that women have historically been deprived of rights that men had, like the right to vote, the right to drive a car, to testify in court, to have a bank account, and so on, in the name of a supposed natural incapacity to make decisions for themselves, has reinforced the structuring of feminism around the claim of autonomy. And so, of course, taking women's consent into consideration is a good thing, but there are serious issues with consent, and so it sounds like today we're moving in the direction of thinking that consent is the sort of magical word that will make us all equal in the bedroom, etc. So that's why we're starting to have more and more feminist voices that voice their concerns about consent. So I'm gonna talk about several issues with consent. The first one is the most simple one, is that we think that consent is going to be the thing through which we're going to know the difference between sex and rape. We think that consent is a sort of magical tool, so there are actually researchers that talk about the magic of consent, because the idea is that consent is going to turn a situation that was rape into sex, or the other way around. Non-consent is going to be the thing that's going to turn sex into rape. And I think this is an intuition we all share, but it is actually very complicated. First of all, because this seems like we would never think that way about a lot of other crimes, right? You wouldn't say, oh yeah, I don't know, a gift is a robbery plus consent. You know, like that's such a weird way of thinking about what it is to gift someone something than to say, oh yeah, you like steal something, but plus the consent, that means a gift or something like that. Like that's just a weird way of thinking about the relationship between rape and sex. But also, there is this idea that all non-consensual sex is rape. And this claim is grounded in our intuitive understanding of rape, and it seems clearly to be true. Like, obviously, if there was no consent, there was rape. This is not only what we intuit, but also what lawmakers have in mind when they define rape. Rape occurs when one of the partners does not agree to have sex with the others, and yet sex takes place. But there are cases when a person claims they had sex against their will, but a court finds they were not raped because the alleged perpetrator had no intention to rape. So this is a very technical point, but this is an important point. In Italian law, like in French law, there is, and in most laws actually, for a crime to be committed, you need to have the material dimension of the crime, but you also need to have the intent. And so that immediately shows that there can be non-consensual sex that is not rape, because if you can, so there are a lot of, when you read the law textbooks, there are a lot of cases, you know, like you thought it was a party, people were drunk and the lights were off, and you enter the room thinking it's your partner in the room and you're a bit drunk and you have sex with them, but you actually took the wrong room. And so it's not like the person had consensual sex with you because they thought it was their partner and it was another person, but it's also not that you intended to rape the person. So we see that it's actually more complicated than it looked. But more broadly, the question of whether all non-consensual sex is rape is an invitation to wonder what it is to not consent. Not agreeing to do something can take many forms. Is it saying no? Or must one struggle frantically? Is it enough to not say yes? So, you know, like, I'm pretty sure you've heard about this. Now I don't have his name anymore. The partner of Giorgia Meloni, who did this. Yeah, John Bruno, like the whole thing that he said about this woman who was raped, but look at how she was dressed, etc. So what is it like? What is it to non-consent? Is it that you say no, but you were dressed slutty, so at the end of the day you were still consenting a little bit? Or all this question about when you drink too much, like can you say you didn't consent if you consented to drink and you know that when you're drunk it's harder to say no to things? So we see that it's very complicated. So is it not really being in the mood, or is it being strongly opposed? If you don't say anything but you actually don't really feel like it, is it non-consent, or do you need to really fight? For the longest time, you know, in court, you needed to show that the man was scratched, that he had bruises, etc. Unless you physically, so there are a lot of cases about having skin of the man under the nails to show that you scratched, because of course, you know, women when they fight, they can only scratch. So there's also like this whole idea. So, for instance, when you have sex with your spouse to please them, even if you don't feel like having sex, do you consent to sex? If your husband is kind of is an asshole that never lets you sleep until he has sex with you, and you're like, I know it's gonna last for 3 hours if I don't yield now. Did you have consensual sex? So we see that it's very complicated, and that the response to these questions will depend on the details of the scenario. In the context of a relationship that is going well and in which sex is not something that is a problem, one can easily conceive of a sexual encounter where you accept sex even if you were not really in the mood because you love your partner. But in the other case, we can see that it's much more complicated if it's your husband that does it every night and tortures you into saying yes to them. And so what I mean by giving all these details is to show that our intuitions of saying, well, it's pretty clear, like either you consent or you don't consent, and if you've consented, it's sex. If you haven't consented, it's rape, is not as simple as that. Then the second limit of consent is the fact that we think about consent as being a legal thing. And you see how the way I've presented things so far, we think in terms of what is going to happen in court. But of course, there's going to be a pretty big difference between the question of should someone be sent to jail, or did you experience something that was harmful to you? So one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to argue that we should raise the question of what is sexual consent on a moral level before doing it on a legal level. Because ultimately what we do in courts is based on what we think is right or wrong as a society. And so we need to have a moral discussion about what is consent before we move on to having a legal discussion. And then even about the legal discussion, I don't know if it's the case in Italy, but in France or in the US, one of the things you hear all the time is that feminists pushing for consent are pushing for people to sign contracts before they have sex. And it's going to be the thing, like now you're going to have an app in which you say that you agreed because after all, the consent thing is a tool of women who have regret the next day. So this is so I'm actually giving a talk in a month with a lawyer that who's going to speak after me, who's the title of her talk is "Sexual Consent is the legislation of a right to regret." And so the idea would be that these women, they get drunk and the next day they see on campus that the guy was ugly, and so they're gonna accuse him of rape, and this is what happens with consent, and so you need to sign contracts. But actually, this is such a misunderstanding of the fundamentals of law. What is the role of consent in law? It intervenes in two different spheres. You have civil law and you have criminal law. In civil law, consent is used for contracts, you know, like you consent. So I consent to buy you your pen, and in exchange, so I promise that I will give you money in exchange for your pen. This is a contract. It is grounded on consent. But it has nothing to do with how we use consent in the criminal sphere. And of course, for rape, we're only interested in the criminal sphere. And in that case, what consent serves for is to establish if a crime happened or not. And so because there are a certain amount of crimes, and rape is one of them, that dissolve if the person consented. So another good example is, how do you say, rapt, or, you know, like you can't kidnap someone with their consent. It's not, so consent there plays a legal role in the definition of the crime. But so it's never about signing contracts, and it's actually very interesting because law says that we cannot sign contracts about sex. And there's this very famous American judge who said, of course, you can't say, I promise you, you can't sign a contract and say, I promise you that I'll have sex with you on Friday, and then on Friday I'm not in the mood anymore, and you say, hey, you signed a contract, like you need to lie down now. Like, we can't do this about sex. So this is a limit of consent, to think of consent through the prism of contract. I'm not looking at the time. So I'm going to go a bit faster. I think other limits of the way we're talking about consent now, another limit is the way we think about consent, like about sexual consent, like any other form of consent. And I don't know if in Italy you read this a lot, but in France and in the Anglophone world, there was this whole analogy between consenting to sex and consenting to tea, you know, where it was like, it's not that hard to understand that if someone doesn't want a cup of tea, you're not like gonna force the cup of tea on them. But of course, like, this is useful in terms of activism to think like that. But of course, there is a specificity of sex, and we think that it is not the same to be forced to drink a cup of tea or to be forced to have sex with someone. And for me, it was very striking because I don't know, for those of you who are philosophers here, there is this tendency in what is called analytic philosophy to reason with analogies. And so I was at this talk about sexual consent, and there was this very fancy professor, like very respected, who said, well, you know, at night, very often my kids want me to kiss them goodnight. And I'm just not in the mood because I'm busy doing something else, but yet, like, I go and I kiss them goodnight. So why is that not wrong? And why is it wrong if I have sex with my wife when she doesn't want to have sex with me at night? Like, why is it different? And for them, it was very clear. And so there was this whole discussion about, like, is this analogy valid? And I think, I mean, it's not in a Catholic country like Italy that I'm going to explain that sexuality is a different realm of human activities than hiking or parenting. But I think this is something we need to think about, that when we use the vocabulary of consent, we are implicitly drawing parallels between sexual consent and a lot of other forms of consent. And that conveys wrong assumptions about what it is to have sex. And I think this is something that is worth discussing. One other problem that is, I think, linked is the fact that when we think in terms of consent, when we think about sex, we isolate the individuals that are having sex. And we're pretending that sex is not a social practice, that the way we were raised, etc., doesn't have an impact, that it's just equal people who are suddenly finding themselves in a bedroom and who decide to have sex or not to have sex. And we're pretending that the social norms of masculinity, of femininity, of political power, etc., do not intervene in the bedroom, and that it's just two people having an arrangement about what they're going to do with each other. And I think this is completely wrong, and that's why we had this conversation yesterday about how my two books are responding to each other. And I started working on sexual consent because I worked on women's submission to men and how society trains women to submit. And therefore, if you think about the fact that it is particularly hard for women to say no, that women are trained to be nice, to be caring, to put other people's desires before theirs, of course this is going to have an impact in the way they have sex with other people. And so this is an issue, right? And that is a transition to maybe one of the last but most concerning limit of talking about consent, is that it makes it sound like consent is a woman's problem. It's very striking because we all have this intuition, right? That about sex, when we talk about consent, is about heterosexual relationships, and it's about how women are going to respond to men wanting to have sex with them. And so there you see all the patriarchal norms that we have, right? Because there's psychologists called the cultural scaffolding of rape, that are these ideologies we have about how sex functions. One of them is that men always want sex. Another one is that women never want sex, but they want love, and they're ready to trade. And the third one is that sex is penetration of a vagina by a penis that ends when the man has an orgasm. And actually, A, it happens that men don't want sex. B, it happens that women want sex. And C, it happens that sex can be other things than that. And that actually, there are a lot of studies that show that penile penetration is not the best way for women to have sexual pleasure. And so all of these myths make it sound like consent is just a problem of how the woman is going to push the guy away. And probably that we want, if the goal is to have freer sex lives and less patriarchal sex lives, having this background assumption that at best a woman consent, so either she refuses or she consents, but she never initiates, for instance, it's going to be a problem. And that men always want and always initiate, it is, of course, also a problem. And I think that is linked to another set of assumptions or maybe not another set of assumptions, but a background set of assumptions that is also very problematic. That is the idea that sex is a battlefield, right? That we are negotiating in sex about a lot of things, about marriage, about, you know, this whole thing that women should not give sex because the more they keep sex for themselves or they don't give themselves, the more likely it is that they're gonna be, that the man is gonna be ready to commit with them, and that a woman who gives herself is gonna be a slut, etc. And so ultimately there's this idea that everyone is losing something in sex. And I think we really need to flip the image, because this is not how it works. And even about sexual pleasure, it's not how it works. That if you have sex with someone and they do something to you, it means that they're getting less pleasure, or that it's a sort of communicating vase system, that you do this to me and in exchange I do that to you, but it's just I do the minimum to not give you too much pleasure. So all of this we have in the vocabulary of consent. There is all this sort of capitalist view of human interaction that is completely, or that should be completely opposite to sex as a realm of human activities. So these are like kind of ideas I have about why sexual consent is problematic. But what I'm trying to show in my book is that there is also in the idea of consent another realm of representation. Even just in the etymology, consent has to do with sensing things together, of like doing an activity together that is co-constructed. And so that's why one of the main theses of my book is that we should transform consent from a sort of capitalistic thing towards a conversation, something that we build together in order to develop abilities about our sexual selves, like better knowledge of ourselves, etc. So I think there's the possibility of reappropriating this vocabulary to do something better with it, but only if we're aware of all these possible limits.
Thank you very much. So I have two sets of comments and questions, and I think we can think of them like the first set as a pars destruens in a way, regarding the oversimplified idea of consent that you debunk in your research, while the second one is more about the constructive part. So I will start with the first intervention so that we have the possibility of doing 2 rounds of questions and comments. So my first comment departs from the fact that I find that one of the most interesting things you do in your research is precisely this fact that you link this rhetoric of consent that we have out there in the public debate today with the idea of subjectivity, both male and female subjectivities, and even non-heteronormative like ideas of subjectivities that is implied by this way of presenting consent, both in legal and in other terms. I think that it is very interesting that in the way you presented the rhetoric of consent in this most simplistic way it is presented today in the public debate does not take into account the fact that we live in societies where women do not enjoy the same room of maneuver, the same possibility to affirm their liberty that men have, because we are born into a world where women's submission to men's desires is the destiny that is presented to them. And this is the object of the other book that is just about to come out in Italian. You do this very much relying on Simone de Beauvoir's theory and thought. demystification that you do is not completely new. Indeed, you base it on Simone de Beauvoir, and it corresponds to the critiques to the neutrality of the abstract subjects of Western philosophy that feminism has brought forward since the first and second feminist waves, and that constituted a most relevant epistemic turn strongly put forward especially by the French and Italian feminist movement in the 1970s. Yet I think, but on this I want to ask you like confirmation of this, that the reason why this demystification is still to be done and redone today, and it is still this relevant and needs to be performed once again, is the fact, and I got the idea that you support this in your book, that the feminism, that particular declination of feminism that manages to be the most influential in the public debate in Western societies, and particularly in the public debate in Western societies on gender-based violence today, and that proposed this oversimplified idea of consent as a solution, comes from the United States and the way and the Me Too movement. A movement that does not have that thick theoretical background that we had here, and that in a way I think we still are in continuity with to some extent when I think about our like feminist, contemporary feminist movements in Europe. So on this my questions are, first of all, did I understand correctly, and did you do you share this sort of like comparative analysis about the way some of contemporary feminist movements and theoretical production work today? And what about other contemporary feminist and transfeminist movements that are not that strictly related to the Me Too movement? I think about Ni Una Menos because that's a movement, a transnational movement that we have also here in Italy and that I know best, which even if it distances itself on different, like even theoretical points from the 1970s feminist perspective, still I think has some continuity in some practices such as the autocoscienza, I don't know the term in English, I think it's self-consciousness and other things. I mean, I would not say that today in Italy we are totally blind, unaware and ignorant of like the feminist tradition that preceded us, even when we depart from that tradition. So what about these in the countries that your research is most based on, that are the French and the United States context? And as a person that also lived in the US, what is your perception of that? Like, is this the only kind of feminism that is there here, or it just manages to be the hegemonic one? Like, to me, as a continental feminist, both as an activist and as a people who do research on this, it is much clear that no specific policy or legal innovation can be truly feminist in its result if it does not presuppose and if it is not coherent with a feminist epistemic term and rethinking of the subjectivity. So when such proposals come from a more contemporary US liberal standpoint, is that why is that according to you? Is that out of ingenuity, of theoretical superficiality, or ignorance of landmark feminist theory that is just not read there? Still, apart from what this means in the US and in the French context, I think it is extremely relevant to talk about this very topic here in Italy today, as we are really in a moment in which at least the idea to do something against gender-based violence is out there, not only in the debate among specialists and activists, but also is taken up by the institution, and it would necessarily be for the better. So perhaps a risk that we are facing nowadays is that this insufficient solution as this inappropriate idea of consent that comes from the US become more influential and manages to permeate even our system even more than the ideas and political struggles that are brought forward from the movements that we have nowadays in Italy, just because these version and these solutions that are not solution do not require a more radical and authentic change in the patriarchal structure of our society, and are not in this way. Now you make this difference between the legal dimension and the moral dimension. I would say that the focus on the legal dimension and the renounce to the thinking about consent, good sex, also from a moral perspective, also means a renounce to think about that in a political way. So this version of feminism, to me, can be considered in a way an apolitical feminism. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I respond to her and then maybe maybe it's easier. Thank you very much, Federica.
We did consent to the structure you proposed, but now we
Sorry, I'm withdrawing my consent. No. I think it's a very deep and complicated question. Because I think there is a phenomenon of American imperialism that we think things in the terms of the American debate. And it's very clear that the way we are talking about consent is with the slogans of American campuses, right? The whole, like, no means no, yes means yes. All of this comes from the battles on American campuses. And these forms of activism are deeply liberal in the sense that at the end of the day, they are negating the social dimension of sex, and it is a problem. And for sure, the way the Me Too movement the Me Too wave has rolled on the world is surprisingly astructural. It was more like, look at all these women that have experienced terrible things. This is really crazy, and why didn't they speak earlier? And so, of course, a lot of feminists have tried to show how there are structural issues about the epistemic injustice that makes it that women are not listened to, or that they know that it will destroy their lives to talk, whereas it's not going to destroy men's lives, etc. But there has been a very liberal way of perceiving Me Too. At the same time, I come from a form of academia that is very French and very Italian, history-based, very theory-based. And I arrived in the US and I felt like their way of writing philosophy, their way of, their focus on clarity, on argument, etc., is a way more efficient form of theorizing. And I think for a French book, my book is very analytic, precisely because I think those very big theoretical frameworks of the 70s, they have clarity issues and therefore issues about democratic outreach. And that this is probably a problem that we've been having, that the feminism of the 70s in France has not always managed to reach everyone with easy slogans. And so I think what you're pointing at is really a tension of feminist academic work of what do we think, what do we think is our responsibility in terms of transforming our work into public outreach, and what do we do about the simplification that happens in activism? So for instance, one of the big things I'm trying to show in my book is that it's not true that every time someone says yes, you have consent to proceed. But if we start to say, oh yeah, well, only yes means yes, well, sometimes you say yes, but is it really yes? And what about all the women who feel like they have to say yes, otherwise they're gonna appear as a tease, or as not a good woman, or as this or as that? And the problem is that you see that then how you're not gonna go to a high school and say, well, it's true that only yes means yes, but what is exactly the yes? It's never gonna provide a good, efficient criterion on how we should proceed with our sex lives. And so there is a problem of the connection of the academic discourse with the public sphere. And I think this is something that I'm struggling with this book, is that you know, sometimes people are like, okay, so tell us, what should we do to not have non-consensual sex anymore? And you're like, well, so there are gender norms. And so you start explaining the entire functioning of patriarchy. And so I think this is probably a problem. You're right that there is something inherently capitalistic in the way we think of sexual consent in the public sphere because of the American Me Too explanation of the phenomenon. And at the same time, they're better than us at providing slogans and means of making progress. And at the end of the day, the Me Too movement has managed a very deep change of sexual lives that none of the feminists of the 70s had managed, at my regret. But I have to say, like I taught in the US for 8 years, and now I'm teaching in Berlin. The level of literacy about sex and desire and consent that I see in young generations compared to when I was in their shoes. And I tried to tell myself that I'm not that old, and so that was a very fast revolution. Like, there has been a huge change that has been rendered possible by this framework. So, yeah.
So,
your turn.
Yeah, not easy now, because everything you've said have complicated the frame in which we're moving, but also I have few things, more comments than questions I have to say, because I feel very sympathetic with your book and with your proposals and analysis for two main reasons, which maybe we can discuss more. The first one is also becoming obvious in this answer, is the fact that the debate on consent is very useful, I think, even when it's in most simplistic way or very elementary way, because it helps us to think about a critique of liberal subjectives and the idea of individual autonomy, that it's not very obvious in many other situation of human lives. So sex and consent, I think, helps us very much in trying to do so. And the other thing that I think your book is really useful to is understanding, as you already said, sex as a social phenomenon and very well inscribed in the patriarchal situation in which we are, but also in the economic situation in which we are. So this is also something that we have to keep in mind, and that in some sense also Me Too helped in a very simplistic way to show that what we think about gender issues are not something cultural, are not something, you know, just immaterial, but are very, very material in both sense, that are in our bodies and in our material condition. Why I'm saying all this, I will say, because I think that what's mostly difficult when we think about consent is detangled all these different kind of aspects that interfere with our understanding of our desires, and on this I will come later, but also on our situation. As you said, sometimes I just can say yes because it's easier, and I'm consenting to something. I will also, maybe I will not regret it, because at the end it's like in a very, cost and benefits situation, the benefits that I perceive are better than good sex. So good sex is not the main goal in life every day, every time. So sometimes we can choose other things. But, and also talking from a country, Italy, in which the law on rape is just from 1996, I don't think we are in the situation in which the critic of consent described, so that we will not have any sex anymore because we will be too scared. And also this summer really proved my point, I think. What I wanted to say more is that due to the fact that sex is inscribed in the patriarchal relation, there is one point in your book that you didn't talk too much now, but that I think it's interesting, is how patriarchal structures shapes our idea of what is sex, what is sexual desire, and what role we have to play in that. So the idea, for instance, that not only the very obvious thing, so like, you have to push a bit a girl to let her say yes, because no one will say yes at the first glance, because they will not be perceived as sluts, but also the idea that there is a part of the erotic game that is the seduction, the not knowing what the other person wants, that it's very common but very gender-based. And this is something that, for me, it's interesting to highlight, at least as I read your book, that it's not just coming from the reaction, and I agree with Federica, of the Me Too, and also a way in which Me Too shaped the debate, but also of the sexual revolution in general. Also in the book there is a part, I try not to do many spoilers if you want to read it, but on sex wars in the 80s, that it's a very crucial point, I think, to understand this. And in the part that maybe now we feel more distant from us, so the anti-sex part, but I think they said something very relevant. So the sexual revolution was something that was relevant for men only, basically. Not only in the sense that they benefit more from the sexual revolution, but again, that sexual revolution shapes again, how we perceive what we have to do with our bodies in sex, so that we have to be happy, always consenting, because if not, we have some problem if we don't like sex that much. And this is something very relevant. And I just want to quote, because we are in Italy, and just to put things in history, because yesterday in Tra le righe, there was this interesting debate on how history shapes the today feminism and how is erased sometimes. Carla Lonzi, in The Clitoridian Woman and the Vaginal Woman, writes, I think, something very clear about this, that the problem, and I'm sorry, I translated it, and I think it's horrible, but I try. And so she writes, "The unexpected of the word is not the male sexual revolution, that is, the uninhibited behavior leading to a renewed prestige of intercourse within couples, groups, communities, or in the universal orgy. Instead, it is the disruption of the penis-vagina sexual model. In this unpredictability lies the potential dissolution of the unsolvable knots created by the patriarchal culture that has subjugated women within the sanctity of the superior-inferior emotional relationship." That said, I know that this is not very helpful if we are trying to have slogans very clear about how to understand sex, and I'm aware of this risk, but if I am very sympathetic with the idea that we can intend sex as a conversation and not as a battlefield, as a place in which we can express our fragilities also, our doubts, our things that we don't know very well what we want. At the same time, I think that this is possible only on a broader level if we revolt, and if we think about the revolution of the patriarchal society, because if not, it will always be too difficult to understand when consenting is consent. And I totally agree that we have to find something to define what is consent. And this is the last point I would like to make. Also, there is an interesting part of the book when Manon deals with Carol Peckman and the sexual contract. And I think that this helps us also to think about, you said we have to think not in a legal way, but in a moral way, and I agree with that. So legal would not be the outcome of the battle on consent. At least it's not what I want, just a better law that explicit in which every point it is consent and it's not. But at the same time, I will add another layer and ask you if, but it's, I think in the wave of what Federica already said, that of course we need to shift from legal to moral, but also from legal to political. Because if not, I think we will just add some more cases, different exception, different point of view that are very useful, but at the same time that will not change the material situation in which we move. I don't know if I made it clear at all, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, Carlota. So it's interesting that I'm not gonna react in order, but it's interesting that you're raising paid men, because as I said, some parts of the book I did here, and all my work on paid men I did in the library here. And I remember that in the sexual contract, she has a moment where she talks. I remember I found it so stupid and ridiculous at the time, where she contrasts, so she uses data about what kind of practices prostitutes were asked to do between 1945 and 1980. And she shows that in 1945, something like 3% of acts that were asked from prostitutes were blowjobs, and that in 1975, it's 85% or something like that. And so there's an explosion of the practice of oral sex. And she says we should be thinking about why is it that this became such an important practice when it is a practice that prevents women to speak at the time where women started speaking. And so, of course, I was like, oh, she exaggerated, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, etc. But there is something about the evolution, how the women's liberation movement and the sexual revolution intertwined. And I think in Italy, like in France, we are in countries where we saw how the sexual revolution was sometimes a way to make, to put women in an even harder position of being cheated on, but it was not cheating, it was being open-minded. You know, this whole thing of being against marriage, and so losing all the protections that were inside the traditional marriage and getting none of the advantage of the end of marriage. And so I think it's true that this is one of the things I tried to do in the book, to show that the result of the sex war, of the so-called sex wars, is not what we thought. It's not true that sex positivity has completely won. And I'm saying, and so a big part of the book that we haven't discussed today is that I work on BDSM. And I think BDSM is very important because it's precisely one of the contentious points of the sex wars, because you have the queer lesbian feminists who say, well, BDSM is a way to replay power relations and to emancipate ourselves from power relations through this sort of cathartic play, and the anti-sex feminists who say, well, you think you're doing catharsis, but you're just doing power play, and it's just power again and again. And I think the reality, when you look precisely at what's going on with the BDSM scene, is that gay and lesbian BDSM can be emancipatory, but when you look at the stats of heterosexual BDSM, the reality is that most long-term relations of domination and submission are men dominating women and controlling them in the idea that it's actually kink and not patriarchy, but you have all these guys that need to be called masters and have a woman clean for them and have all the sex that they want with them, etc. But it is, yeah, and so the idea is that it is not at all patriarchy. It's a subversion of patriarchy, but it looks very much like patriarchy for a subversion, and so that I'm kind of. And again, I think there are ways to do emancipatory BDSM, but what I'm trying to do is to revive the memory of the sex wars, to say, well, maybe we were wrong to think in the 90s, oh yeah, sex positivity is the way to go, etc. And that there are, if we want to finish the sexual revolution, we need to make it possible for queer people and for women, and that involves, yeah, like, comment on dit, tirer le bilan, to make the, like, counting exactly what happened and how patriarchy has not been removed from its place. And so I think, I don't know, was Amina Srinivasan's book very successful here, The Right to Sex? Was it translated in Italian? So there is this Oxford professor called Amina Srinivasan who wrote this book called The Right to Sex that was a huge bestseller in the US and in the UK last year. And she has a paragraph and that is called on porn that is very good. But she, I think her and me and a few other people right now, what we're trying to do is complicate the memory of the sex wars by showing that there are still a lot of things that need to be done, and that the anti-sex people were not as stupid and backwards as it was said. And I think a big important part of it is indeed seduction. And it's refreshing for me to talk about this here and not in the US, because of course in the US they're always like, oh yeah, but French people, they're terrible. Like, you know, like if you watch Emily in Paris, it's all about like, but it's, so I don't know, like my impression, when I watched Emily in Paris, I was really embarrassed because I think it's true that when you're American and you arrive in Paris, you're petrified by how much French people talk about sex all the time, and that like sex is really the moving energy of everything, that everyone is talking about, having affairs and this and that and seduction. And I think Italy is a bit more conservative than France in that regard, but that there's still this, and that this is also why psychoanalysis played such a big role in France and in Italy. And well, I'm trying to work on the impact on psychoanalysis on seduction right now, because I think in France and in Italy and in Argentina, etc., psychoanalysis has played a big role in justifying a sort of male domination in the name of the libido, and in the name of women being just masochistic and frigid, and so all these sort of pathologization of desire through psychoanalysis. But there is a question about drive, ultimately. And I used to think, and so when I wrote the book, it was also a response to this this panic in France that America is gonna kill the French lover power, and the fact that in France we know what the art of love really is, etc. And that it's true that for me, going to study feminism in the US and working in the US, I was like, oh wow, so now I can talk to professors and not wonder if they're gonna like grab my butt, or if they're gonna make a move on me, or if they're gonna comment. Like, I really, at the ENS, I remember I had this mentor who once in Paris who once told me, oh yeah, your perfume is this, no? You know, it's very well known to have exactly the smell of a woman's pussy, so you just smell like woman pussy. You know, like, it used to be perfectly normal to say that to a student. And so I arrived in the US, and the fact that this was over was really a relief. But then, now after a long time in the US and living in Germany, where they're also really not like that, I wonder about what do we do about seduction? Because there is something that is political about seduction, that is patriarchal about seduction, but that is also an important human experience. And I don't know, like, is there a way to reappropriate seduction, to reinvent seduction in a way that would not be patriarchal? I think, you know, like in Berlin, it's very interesting, and in Germany in general, because people don't pair up anymore. Because people don't, like, it's so respectful that seduction is not possible anymore. And so that there's a big discussion about how do you start something. And so consent also has this question of, can we start something? So what would it be? I always say this when I want to show the sort of patriarchal ideology inside consent, that I say, of course, we don't think that consent is a woman going to a guy at a party and saying, just in case you wonder, for me it's a yes, you know? Like, people would be like, oh, this is really weird, etc. But that should be what consent is, right? That you verbalize your desire. And so why do we think it's so weird that a woman would do something like that, and that she would, maybe it would be her disrespecting herself or looking like she's really desperate. But so I think you're right to point that there's a question about seduction. How do we eroticize life? How do we go on the level of the erotic if we want to have egalitarianism in the erotic life? And I think this is probably one of the big things we need to figure out right now. I don't have a ready-made answer.
Yeah, so even if you don't have like a full answer to that, I think that in the book you still envisage some way out from the alternatives that we have today that still has into account the idea that we still want to have relationships and even sexual encounters, etc. And like when and I think you make some points emerge that have not emerged yet in our conversation today. Like when you propose your idea of consent as a conversation, and it also comes to my mind that I think I saw what in my mind can be considered like a plastic representation of that in a movie quite recently. That is a movie with Emma Thompson. Like in Italian, the title was translated as Il piacere è tutto mio. It's not very much about seduction because it's about the sexual encounter between a woman and a sex worker. So it's not about that, but still there is a scene that I think is a very good example of how a conversation on consent can be kept forward continuously during a sexual encounter without that encounter losing like sexiness or its erotic energy, which I think is very good. So, but
can I just
yeah,
respond to, because I think that was a very important question for me when I first. So it's a long story, but the first time I talked about consent publicly, it's because after the Me Too movement, there were, in French media, they were desperately looking for people who had feminist credentials. And the problem is that in French academia, like in Italian academia, everyone was discouraged to do anything feminist. And so I had defended my dissertation 3 months earlier, and according to my supervisor, I don't know if it was true, but it was the first feminist philosophy dissertation ever defended at La Sorbonne. And so it turned out that the journalist from Libération had typed like consent and stuff on Google, and she found the announcement of my dissertation defense. And so she found my contact and she wrote to me and she said, we need someone who has some competence about what's going on. Could you give an interview with us? So I did, and I explained this idea of affirmative consent. And for me, because I was already living in the US at the time, it was very evident, this idea that only yes means yes, and that we should have verbal, that we should have actual discussions about consent. And it was crazy, like the amount of pushback I received of people sending me emails that I was about to destroy everyone's sex lives, and that people like me, that I should stay in the US and never come back. And there was one of my professors who wrote a response in an online media where he said that it was really a preposterous idea, and had he had to ask all the women he had had sex with during his life, maybe he would have been left with masturbation. And so it was crazy for me, because this guy, who was a very respected philosopher, was saying publicly that basically his entire sex life was made of rape, or at least non-consensual sex. But what struck me was that it was impossible for French people at the time to imagine that consent could be anything else than a love killer. And so in the book, I draw a parallel between consent and condoms, that we have this sort of idea that consent is as uncomfortable and terrible as condoms. It's the thing that you're going to do right before having sex. It's going to kill the mood. You need to get rid of it, like pretend it didn't happen, and then you can go. You know, like it's like oh, you put the condom, the conversation is being had, we can go. And so what I found, I think this idea is predicated on an idea that we know what sex is. So it's like, you know, I don't know, I think you had that also during COVID, the QR code, you know, you would go to the restaurant and show your QR code. And I feel like we think of consent that way, that you scan the QR code, it says, yes, you can go, and then we know you can go for where. Like it's as if the highway is already paved. And so it shows that we actually have a very patriarchal, predefined understanding of what a sexual relationship would be. Because then, I don't know if I should say this publicly, but it's actually very clear that when women do things to men during sex that are not belonging to this script, men are like, well, she should have asked before doing this. Like, imagine if you penetrate a man's body without asking, then suddenly men are very aware of how consent works and that it's really important, you know? And so it says something about how we consent, how we conceive of sex. But also it shows that we have this idea that sex would be a sort of animal side of ours in which language should not intervene. And for me, it was very interesting because some of the most vocal adversaries of consent in France are very important traditional intellectuals that that really value culture, you know, that are the guys who talk about opera, about literature, etc. And then the idea that you would talk during sex, they're like, it's insane for them. But one thing that I find interesting is you would never go to a 3 Michelin star restaurant alone, because you think that speaking about what you're eating is part of taking more pleasure in your eating. So why would you think that speaking about sex when you're having sex is going to make your pleasure smaller? And I think for us Italians and French, it's a good it's a good analogy, because we see how talking about food doesn't make eating food less pleasant or less of an experience. Quite the opposite. We think that language has an ability to make it more of an experience. So my partner is German, and unfortunately, as someone said last night, nobody's perfect. He didn't choose it, but. When we got married, we were offered a meal in a by my side of the family, a meal in a very good restaurant, and it was to happen 1 week later. And for 1 week, with a lot of friends, we talked about this restaurant and what we would probably eat and how it would be. And my husband was like, "French people, you're insane. I don't understand. It's been probably 50 hours of conversation about a meal that has not been had yet." And it's true that it was part of the pleasure for me, like the whole week of talking about it, of what we would like and how it could be and maybe what, and then talking about it afterwards. And so why is it that we think about sex that talking about it would make it less good, that having a conversation the next day about what we liked or didn't like about the sex that was had, or that, like, why do we think it's less good? I think what happens is actually more that we have this very Christian, traditional taboo that makes it very hard for us to have the words. And this is why I think that conceiving of consent as a conversation is an emancipatory practice. Because I think what we need eventually, what we need ultimately is the ability to talk about sex. But that this is a skill that we don't have, and that is extremely awkward at the beginning. And that it gets less and less awkward with talking about it. So I saw it, so there are studies that show, for instance, that one of the most efficient ways to prevent children from being victims of sexual violence is to teach them about their body parts with the right words. Because predators know that a kid that knows how to name their body parts, it means that they talk with their parents about these kind of things, and so they will likely talk if something happens to them. So it's one of the big things about prevention for kids to tell them about their body parts with the right words. And so when I had kids, I started having to use the terms, you know, like vulva and labia and, you know, anus, etc. And for me, at the beginning, it was really hard. You know, I wanted to say, you know, these sort of little words we have for kids, like wee or whatever, that allow to not use the terms. But I see how now using the word vulva or clitoris is so normal for me, and penis. And so my kids, I see, because they're, oh, Papa has a penis, and does this person have a penis, and does this person have a penis? And sometimes we're like, we hope at daycare they don't talk about Papa's penis all the time, because people would be very concerned. But I think this is also what happens in sex as a conversation, is that the more we talk with the right words about our desires, the more we're able to even think about our desires and to have this subjective apprehension of why we want sex, what we like in sex, what we're hoping to accomplish through sex. So yeah, I think that's one of the things. That's why I think cinema is helping us see that consent can be actually very sexy, and that once we overcome the awkwardness of talking about sex, it actually becomes a sort of emancipatory thing to have the vocabulary of talking about our desires.
Yeah, indeed. And on this, I really wanted to read a short passage from your book on this, and then I have a comment on that. I will read it in Italian, but it's about what you just said. Si sottintende che il rispetto e l'attenzione per l'altro o per l'altra, considerati necessari nelle relazioni interpersonali, non dovrebbero trovare spazio anche nella sessualità. Qui ci troviamo di fronte ad un riflesso puritano che cerca di salvaguardare un presunto mistero del sesso, concepito come qualcosa di sacro che la parola verrebbe a profanare. Ma se si comprende che la morale ha la funzione di valutare la qualità delle nostre azioni, non c'è motivo di pensare che le norme morali abituali non debbano applicarsi tra persone che si amano o che hanno rapporti intimi l'una con l'altra. Al contrario, la vulnerabilità creata dai sentimenti amorosi e affettivi richiede un'attenzione maggiore. I nostri atti non sono necessariamente buoni e noi non siamo sgravati da ogni responsabilità morale in nome dell'intimità. I think that what you, well, I think you also say that explicitly, that what is implied by this idea of consent as a conversation is the idea of a subject as a relational subject that is not just a self-sufficient monad for which relations just constitute a mere supplementary add up to something that he or she already is. But one subject that is conceived as an ever-transforming and changing in their desires, also depending on its continuous interaction with the other. And this conception of the subject is also coherent with the contemporary feminist paradigms on care and vulnerability a lot. But it is true that we don't really talk a lot about the link between these theoretical perspectives and what they mean in the dimension of sexual intercourses. Of course, I mean, from different theoretical perspectives, like Carla Ronzi used to do that a lot, and it is not by chance that they are republishing her entire works today in Italy. So starting from this idea of conceiving the subject as a vulnerable, open subject, and in this case you are not referring just to women, but like to everyone, no? To something that is relevant also for male, I think you do a very important, you perform a very important operation that has as a consequence the fact that this perspective that you suggest in the book and the idea of consent as a conversation can be particularly liberating. And you says that not only that it could be also liberating for men, but that it can be even more like particularly liberating for men's sexual desire and authentic pleasure, which I think is a good way to argue how this feminist rethinking of the subject is also a conceptual, political, epistemic operation of utmost relevance, not only for women in the way feminist studies are usually conceived in the general debate, and that does this change of perspective and this rethinking of the subject as a relational subject should be central not only in feminist philosophy conceived as a niche, but in the most general philosophical discussion at large. And on this point, I mean, I'm very much in line with what you write.
Yeah, because my second part was precisely on this, and so I will try to be brief, and then. So I agree with Federica that this is a very relevant part of the book, and I read it in my mind in a strong relationship with a book that it's recently been translated into English, but I don't know if you've ever met, that is from an Italian philosopher, Lorenzo Bernini, that it's called The Sexual Political, in which he uses precisely, starting from a male point of view, he uses the works of Bersani, for instance, on the anality, I don't know if in English is a word, anality, but I think yes, and on the idea of penetrating and be penetrated, but also on the idea of sex, as you already said, as a drive that we do not fully understand. We don't really understand our desires. We don't really know until we do it what we really like and what we dislike. There are things that we very much like in theory and that then we try, it's awful. And also there are desires that we dislike very much in theory and that we sometimes are also a bit ashamed of. But this, that it's sometimes in the debate on consent sees as a problem. I think that for you and Bernini, it's what is interesting in sex to think about human fragility and openness to others, and also the pre-understanding of human as that we do not come as individual but as relations. And I just quote a few lines from Lorenzo's book, because he says, to think the human starting from the sexual and the anal means to think the human as a receptive and penetrable body crossed through by air and food, just as it is by the uncanny force that of the drive that comes from its exterior in an ecological relation with society and the environment. And then add to this, it means to reflect on the possibility of activating, beginning with the recognition of a common ontological masochism, a radical ethical posture of recognition of the primacy of the other over the self, and to start a conversation in this sense that also, and this is the last point I would like to make, that also helps us to not think that what is best in a sexual relation is a connection that comes out of nowhere without asking. This is something that it's very common, that we perceive a good sexual intercourse as something that flows with no interruption, with no proper words in it. But also, this is something another Italian feminist of the 70s highlights, I think, very well in a book on education called Dalla parte delle bambine, on girls' side, I would say. And she said, women are often complimented for their intuitiveness, their capacity to understand the desires of others before they even express it, but this is precisely the ability of the subaltern, that have to understand the desires of the others before they say it, to avoid violence, to avoid the risk of, in this case we can say, being raped. And so I think that also understanding sex as something uncanny, not really understandable, that it's not a cup of tea and that it's more complicated of this, can really, in the way in which Federica was saying, can really help us to think of our relation in a different way, in which we can say, okay, we don't need, okay, to understand desires of others, it's beautiful, but we don't need to properly do that, and we don't need to do it with ourselves also. We can think about the relation with ourselves in this way, to ask sometimes openly, what do we like? That it's not something that at least we as women are educated to. So just to put some more things.
Thank you. No, that's very, so that also connects with what you had said earlier that I didn't really respond to, about legal to moral, or moral to political, or legal to political. I think ultimately when I say it's a moral question before being a legal question, I mean that it's a political question before being a legal question, because then I explain how so I go back on the intellectual history of this idea that the intimate is the personal is political, and that the intimate is political, and that there is, in the question of how to behave well towards each other, we need to take political dominations into account. So I think you're right that there is a question about making all the political dimensions that are hidden in the naturalization of femininity reappear. That this this ability to immediately connect sexually has to do with responding to men's desire before men even have to express those desires. So sort of attunement to the desires of others that is expected in the care work that sex is part of. And I think one of the things that was at the beginning of this book for me was actually a conversation I had with a male friend about sex as politeness. And so by that, I'm not sure my translation is very good, but I remember that we were talking about sexual intercourse that happened, and I said, but did you feel like you had to because this person was really into you, and like it was nice to her to have sex with her? And he was like, what are you talking about? Like, that I would have sex with her to be nice to her? Like, and there was this sort of, he's like, well, it's not like I love her or anything like that. And I said, no, but it could be sex for being polite. And I could see that he was completely puzzled by this idea. And then I, as a sort of game with myself, and really not sociologically sound, but I started asking all of my girlfriends, do you see what I'm talking about when I say having sex with someone to be polite? And of course, all of my girlfriends were like, yes, of course, like we've all done that, right? And then I started talking with my guy friends, and they said, oh, you mean when you love someone and you have sex with them because they're in the mood to have sex that day? I said, no, like this is sex out of love. I'm talking about someone, like you're at a party, there's this person that clearly has a crush on you, who's made a lot of effort, etc., and you feel like you kind of need, it would be not nice to not proceed and have sex with this person, etc. And the fact that there was this sort of gap, again, like this is not sociologically sound as a study. It's not like I did a study on this. But to see that all the women I was talking to knew exactly, like had this experience of having sexual encounters they didn't sexually desire, but because they felt like it was a form of care for that other person. And that it was very clear for all the guys I was talking to that sex was not a form of care for other people, except in long-term monogamous relationships. Maybe eventually you could maybe do that, but that it was really not in their imagination that it could happen. And that actually some of them were really horrified when we were having these conversations, because they were like, oh, you mean it's possible that some people have sex with me out of pity, or because they feel like I really tried to seduce them, so they need to reward me, etc. And they were really terrified. And I was like, well, yeah, it's very highly probable. But and I think this is the kind of political dimension of sexuality, and this is one of the strong limits of the vocabulary of consent, that we're not, when we talk about consent, we're kind of erasing all these imaginary frameworks that we have about good reasons to have sex, why you do have sex, what you're afraid of when having sex. And so, of course, like it's first and foremost a political account of sex that I'm trying to give. But then I want to connect this with what Federica was saying about the fact that even men would have better sex if we were practicing consent as a conversation or sex as a conversation. And I'm deeply convinced of that. And at the same time, I'm deeply uncomfortable with this argument. So as I told some of you last night, when my first book came out, because it's feminine. So how do you say in Italian? Non se nasce sottomessa? What is the translation of the book that we talked about yesterday? So, yeah, so you have sottomessa. So it's very clear that it's about women. And so the result is that when the book came out in France, it was the same. It was On ne n'est pas soumise, on le devient. Only women read it. And so it was really crazy. Like when I would do events in bookstores, there would never be guys. Maybe one saying, well, I'm also very submissive because when I go on vacation with my wife, she buys the tickets and she decides where we're going. And, like it was this sort of intervention. It was also in 2018, so things have changed a bit since. But there was this idea that it was a book for women. And for me, it was really disheartening because all that I was trying to do with that book was to say, like, it's interesting for everyone to read about feminism, including for men, but it didn't work. And I received, it was crazy, it happened like 10 times that I received emails from colleagues telling me, oh, my wife really loved your book. And they always assumed that it was perfectly fine to tell me. They, of course, didn't read it because it was not concerning them. And so when I wrote my second book, I said, okay, like I want it to not be clear that it's not a book for men. Like I think we actually need, if I make the case that I think we should be having a conversation about sex, it should be a conversation that includes men. And so we had a big discussion about the title of the book. And so, like jokingly, I told my publisher, oh yeah, we should put sex in the title because then men are gonna read it, And the sad part is that it worked. And that like the readership of the second book is way more masculine than feminine, actually. Also because I think in France, like it's more technical philosophically than the first one. And so like a lot of journalists that write about philosophy are men when it's more philosophy than feminism. So my first book, for instance, it's always put in feminism in bookstores, and the second one, it's put in philosophy. So it has a difference of readership. And so one thing was that people told me, oh, but a good way to sell your book would be to tell men they would have better sex if they were to be feminist. And in a way, I have a higher, I want to have a higher view of men than to think that the only way they could, like, embrace feminist values would be to be having better sex. Like this is such a, also patriarchal, it contributes to exactly those myths about sexuality that I'm trying to dismantle, that like ultimately the only thing that interests men is sex, and so then you should tell them, feminism is good for you because you will get more, like so I agree, but I don't want to bring this argument forward because I think I think a man should want to be feminist for justice and equality and not just for getting better sex. That better sex is just a perk on the side. I think Simona wants to...
Yes, I would like to raise a question. So thank you to the three of you. And do you hear me?
Yeah, yes. We hear you and we see you.
Okay. Well, two questions connected, but not totally. So I'm very, very sympathetic and with your position. And while I was reading your book, I was telling myself, so this is a very good point to bring to light the simplicity of the notion of consent. Each other angle would be poor in comparison to the sexual angle. So thank you, first of all, because I think that this is a move in political philosophy, not only in feminism. To face a point of view also very concrete that everybody can touch how simplistic is the perspective of consent, which doesn't mean that we have to avoid this perspective. And one point related to this that leads me to the other point. Yes, the view on consent is simplistic also because the liberal idea of consent and social contract is implied a poor idea of power, something that it seizes, it ends with the consent. And this is one of the reasons I think that the sexual relationships don't work so much through the idea of consent. And so this brings me to the second question. The idea of conversation, the ethical and political aspect of this idea and this part of your work. I connect myself to what you were saying about seduction before. So I think that we, of course, for having a good sex, we have probably or avoid the patriarchal ideology. This for sure, of course, from a feminist perspective. But could we avoid, and coming back to the other consideration, can we avoid sexual relationships as power relationships? So about this, I'm a bit more skeptical, just because I don't have a liberal idea of power, of what power is. But I have a, let's say, even if not equal, but a more Foucauldian idea of what power is and how it circulates.
Yeah, I agree.
No, if I was confused, but
No. I think you're absolutely right. I think both you and I, we have a Foucauldian understanding of power, and or at least partially. At least we think that the sort of simplistic description of power being what happens between someone on top and someone under, and it just one directional, and there are this idea that some people would not be taken in power networks, etc., doesn't work. And so I think you're right that sex is inherently riddled with power relations, and that this is not something that's going to disappear tomorrow. And I think in a certain way, it doesn't need to disappear. My idea with sex as a conversation is precisely to say there needs to be work to equalize or to fight the power relations that happen during sex, so that everyone's voice can be heard. And so one of the arguments that I have is that typically conversation is a practice in which people in position of power can equalize the footing so that something can happen between two people. So what I mean is that you can have a conversation with a professor in which the professor lowers their superiority to create the condition for an equal discussion. So of course, it's not going to be completely equal, but there's going to be it's on the professor to create conditions for a real exchange of ideas that is not, for instance, a sort of hierarchical, or not primarily a hierarchical exchange of ideas. And I think in the same, like analogically, it is, in most cases, in men's hands to create conditions for sex to be more equal, to fight. So one example that I give in the book is that a lot of women, most women know that statistically it is likely enough that men can resort to violence when they don't get what they want sexually. And so I think it's men's responsibility to désamorcer, to de-escalate, or to create conditions in which women have good reasons to think they are not going to resort to violence, but that it's a sort of flipping of the way we think about sexual consent, because, as I said earlier, we always think that it's women's responsibility to stop the thing, whereas I think the real moral responsibility is on the person that is supposed to be receiving consent and having power to render the possibility of real consent or real non-consent to be listened to and heard and received. But of course, I think we can try to dismantle patriarchal ideology, but like power is part of human relations. The question is, even if we think power is part of human relations, we can want to build equality. So my idea is more to think in terms of equality than in terms of, or let's say, equality and justice.
Maybe mobility, so change of parts and not to hierarchical position that are fixed once and for all.
Yeah, exactly. So some sort of fluidity in the power relation. And so we were talking yesterday about objectification. And so I agree typically with Martha Nussbaum that the problem is not that we objectify people in sex. The problem is if it's always the same people who are objectified and always the same people who think they're subjects. But of course, if you're having a heterosexual relationship, the woman is going to objectify the man in the sexual relation and the other way around. And that's what the kind of thing that we want, is that there's a objectification that is fluid and that can be reversed. The problem is when it solidifies as some people that are systematically objects and some people who are inherently subject. And I think, and so to respond to your first question, or that was maybe also linked to this question of power, of course, the problem with consent is that it's pretending that social life is not first organized by power. And it's creating this fiction that there are spaces where we have that we can take individual outside of the power relations and outside of the ideological scripts, etc., and that they can be independent, selfish, homo economicus, basically. So it's a sort of, it's the same sort of simplification as the simplification of the homo economicus in economics. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Giovanna. A little break, no? I'm down to have a little break, if that's okay. Yeah, thank you very much. See you soon. Yeah, I was like, I won't need a break.
Ci troviamo tra un po'?
Sì, ricominciamo alle 18.
Ok.
Also because now in this room it's very, very, very hot.
Yeah, it's hot. Yeah.
I'm sweating.
Yeah, it's so hot.
Once it's, so just raise your hand and let's go. Let me just say thank you for this conversation. It was really inspiring to me, and it opened up a lot of questions for me. I had just one out of curiosity, and especially about seduction. I do think that how you presented the problem of seduction and sexual intercourse and sexual relationships is, of course, since the theme is consent, really focused on heteronormative kind of situations, but especially for the question of seduction, I do think it is useful kind to see or go seeing how sexual intercourse, sexual relationship works in non-heterosexual situations, especially in the light of some kind of non-escaping situation of the power dynamics inside sexual intercourse. And in my mind and in my position as an homosexual man, I do ask myself, there is kind of alternative of patriarchal kind of idea of seduction in the history of this kind of ways of going away from patriarchal ideology in kind of the history of lesbianism or the history of homosexual men, or there is also, and I do think there is, some kind of mimetic kind of relationship with the patriarchal way of understanding power, and so that even in non-heterosexual relationship there is also this kind of dynamics of power, and maybe we can kind of accepting this kind of dynamics and not thinking of power in a conflict way where it is kind of someone that needs to be oppressed and someone that is the oppressor, but maybe in a kind of agonistic way, where conversation plays a central role, but is also a tension between these two subjects. There is a more agonistic in the way that like two people kind of work together in this kind of sexual dynamics, but not in a power relating and oppression kind of way. So this is kind of my question.
Thank you. That's very interesting because actually, so I don't talk about it as directly as I could have in the book, but Grindr has played an important intellectual role in my book because I think it allowed me to think about how I judge that it's extremely important to distinguish negotiation and conversation. Because I think that it's absolutely not the case in all of gay relationships, etc. But there is a model, especially in the US or in the gay community in Tel Aviv, for instance, of mainstreaming of gay encounters that happens through apps with a sort of sometimes capitalistic view of I need to lose as little time as possible by getting as much pleasure as possible, giving as little in return as possible, and we diminish the risk, you know? Like I remember a friend telling me recently, he was like, you know, I don't know what to do because it's the first time in 10 years that I'm interested in a guy and that I want to have sex with a guy that I haven't seen the penis of before we have sex. And I don't know, and he says, I always see the penis before we do anything by picture, etc. And so how does it change the way seduction happens, this sort of risk-benefit analysis on the apps? And I think there's from what I've read and heard, etc., there is a sort of suffering and loneliness that is created by this commodification of sexuality that happens in apps and especially in gay apps and but also on Tinder it's the case too. But I think because of all this patriarchal myth, men don't dare being as straightforward in heterosexual Tinder discussions as they are in the gay Tinder grinder. And I think instead of reaching a sort of conversation point, we go from it's a new version of sex as a battlefield that emerge, instead of a very essentialist view of men want sex, women want love, so women should try to stay as pure as possible and men should hunt them. We have this sort of commodification of, I want to know exactly what's going to happen, I want to be prepared, lose as little time, and be released of the tension of the sex, etc. And so I'm hoping to, like I think especially in the COVID time, etc., we saw how the apps can create a sense of loneliness and a disappearance of seduction that is complicated, and that with the very good intent of saying, well, seduction is not this unverbalized thing, that this magic that happens in the air, etc. We're transforming it into a commodity in a way that is not existentially very satisfying. And so my worry is that there is a sort of, capitalist impulse in seduction that is making love and sex very difficult. I mean, it's the if I lose kind of view about the end of love, but this sort of concentration on the self, of like being always the best version of yourself, so you need to work out and have a therapist and have your sex encounters, but it should not take too much space over your work time, and this sort of constant optimization of the self that is contradictory with the uncertainties of seduction. Does it, I mean, maybe you have things to respond to this, but no? Okay.
So thank you, first of all. And I was thinking about like what you said about like conversation as a form of consent, like conversation as the tool of like giving or like talking even about consent. So that's like the point. And I was thinking like, okay, but like language has a big role into like everything. So if I think about that conversation, and I think about like a group of people that arrived to that conversation and that have been like created and designed and that like exist, and like they have existed for thousands of centuries, maybe not thousands, but like centuries, and then even millennials, like in a male gaze. So there's a group that has been created in a language, in a gaze, and there's a group that have done that. So of course, this makes me think that like maybe it's something that was like obvious to you, and but I'm just trying to like see if I got the point, because like to arrive to that conversation and like to that conversation to be possible, we need a different type, of course, of education. So maybe if you could say something more about like both education, of course, and I'm really like glad you mentioned before the kids saying sex words, and like that's important too, and like that kind of education, and also the role of representation, because desire, and I think sexual desire too, is mimetic. So I can like think about what I want and like how I want it because I saw that somewhere, and it would like. I would like if it wasn't like that, but I think it is. And so, like, representation, and also, of course, in the sexual discourse, and speaking about consent, sexual consent, pornography, and that kind also of representation of, like, not only roles and even the consent stuff.
Yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. So I think it's not just that we're illiterate about sex, is that our literacy is wrong. Like the language that we have, like in a way what you're saying is very close to the Audre Lorde idea that you don't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, and that it was this discussion in the 1970s that language is masculine and conveys patriarchal order, etc. But there are two things, I think. First, when I proposed the concept of conversation, I insufficiently, but still contrasted, or in my head at least, my idea was to, like, I didn't use conversation by chance. I used conversation by opposition to negotiation, but also by contrast to dialogue and to even discussion. And because in dialogue, by opposition to conversation, what you have is the idea that you have two people who may even speak like next to each other, but not really at each other. And that in the idea of conversation, the agents of the conversation kind of disappear towards the result that the conversation is. And so the idea of a conversation is a sort of convergence of effort to create something that is outside the two persons who talk. A good conversation is a conversation that is co-built, but that exists in a way outside each person that contributes to it. And so my idea is that by practicing this conversing, we're acquiring skills about how to be a good conversationalist, and those skills entails creating a new vocabulary. And I think so I think where I'm trying to make an original contribution is that I think indeed it's not like we have desires and a self that are alinguistic and in a way a priori from ideology or from social norms. And so it's not like through conversation we're gonna reach our own self or something like that. Is that we are shaped by language, by ideology, but through conversation we can change this shaping and practice equality. And so I think this only happens at, like, there's only so much you can do in a certain way. And that's connected to my work on submission. When I wrote this book on submission, there were all these magazines. I got a lot of requests like, can you do a short thing like 5 ways to stop being submissive, you know? And my idea was to say, we're all submissive. There's no strategy to stop being submissive. We can practice at the individual level a sort of consciousness raising about our submission and way to frame our own experiences that can help us marginally be less submissive, but it is first and foremost a structural problem. But what I think is that by conversing about sex, we're making a vocabulary of self-knowledge and intersubjective knowledge appear that is necessary for equality. So that it's a sort of contribution to a social movement towards creating new tools. but that it's true. I'm sorry for the few of you who were here yesterday. I'm repeating something I said yesterday, but it's very common that people tell me, oh yeah, but about sex, the big question is education. And I agree. But when people say the big problem is education, they mean we should talk about this in schools. And the problem is that there is such a sort of pessimism to think about this, because it's as if for all of us here, it's done. We have no more chance. Like maybe for our kids, things are going to be different, but for us, we're lost. So the next like 60 years we're going to live, it's going to be bad sex, and that's too bad. So I think no, like yes, we should think in terms of education, but education in retirement houses, in even in the psychiatry hospitals, because like of course there's an aspect about consent that is also very ableist and was very liberal in the idea of only people in full possession of who they are can consent. But the question is, how do we practice consent with people who have dementia, with people who are like who have psychiatric disorders, etc. Like, how do we conceive of consent for people who are mental handicaps of some sorts? And so, yes, education, but education for everyone. And education for everyone, in my opinion, comes with this even individual practice of shaping words. But I agree with you that language is sexist, but that we can practice it in a way that it becomes less so. But, you know, it's the Catherine McKinnon says this. So she's for those of you who don't know her, she's a legal theorist and philosopher who created the concept of sexual harassment. So we all owe her a lot. And she was one of the heads of the anti-sex movement. And she says, she has this sentence where she says, man fucks woman, subject, verb, object. And where she says it's written in the language that sexuality is what men do to women. And like even this, like we need to think about this, like how, like a lot of people told me, oh yeah, you say, you talk about doing sex with other people, etc. That's such a English way of putting things. But precisely, I'm interested in this idea of saying we do sex with each other, because it sounds weird, but that's also a way to avoid this idea that men fuck women, you know? Like, how do we reinvent a way of talking about sex that is less gendered, less dominant, less patriarchal?
Hi, so thank you for your visit, and I'm sorry to continue the monopoly of this aisle on the questions, but will do. So, I was interested by your talk about BDSM, and I found it interesting that when it comes to BDSM and also prostitution, but that's another story, there are often talks about how there's the risk of perpetuating a hierarchy, in this case, patriarchy. And much of the problem I see is that there are two ways to conceive of this, that is, reproducing patriarchy as in reflecting it and perpetuating it. So for example, when it comes to straight couples who are in a BDSM relationship, you can say on one hand that many times straight couples in BDSM relationships reflect patriarchy in that they carry over prejudices from the wider society into their bedroom. And on the other hand, some people who call themselves feminists have argued that not only do they reflect it, but they also reproduce it in that what they do in their bedroom perpetuates a sort of oppression. And it's an important distinction because on the one hand, the kinky community, kinky people in general, often talk about the first one, That is, how do we reflect the hierarchies that are in the outside world, let's say, outside of the bedroom, and how can we combat that? How can we avoid that? And on the other hand, the discussion about perpetuating hierarchy is the one that is generally tied to anti-sex feminists, and that rightly generates backlash. And so in terms of the data, because obviously when speaking about sexual minorities, there is often trouble gathering data. For example, you said that most straight couples in BDSM relationships are...
In long-term BDSM relationships.
In long-term BDSM relationships are with a dominant man and a submissive woman. But of course, one could ask, obviously, since there is a stigma attached to submission for men, that could make these kinds of relationships harder to find because the participants could wish to hide it. Or on the other hand, it could be more common to form these relationships because, again, it is perceived as more normal. And so, in light of this, when you said, it's like I'm seeing patriarchy again, or something to that effect, with regards to straight couples in BDSM relationships, I wanted to ask, do you consider it in the optic of a reflection of outside patriarchy, or
a reproduction? So
yes.
So first of all, so thank you for your question. Of course, we haven't talked about we basically haven't talked about my analysis of BDSM, but it's not like I briefly talked about. I briefly thought about this. I've worked on this and read almost all the literature in sociology and anthropology and sex studies, and it's not the same to have like dumb sub-practices and to be a BDSM participant. You can't claim to be a BDSM participant if just at home your wife holds you on a leash. This is like BDSM has community meetings and rules and set of norms, etc. And so it's actually possible to do studies, sociological studies about BDSM participants because they have websites where they meet and dungeons and meetings, etc. So we have actually trustworthy data about who does what.
Self-selecting, as in the people who participate in the community and the people who are willing to report data are self-selecting, right?
Yes and no. So the problem is that it's not the same to have submissive practice at home and to be in a collective organization of BDSM. But among the collective organization of BDSM, there, like the sociologists who work there are participating members, and among those people, there's no, like, it's not seen as negative to be a sub, like quite the opposite, right? Like, if anything, like subs also, because there's a whole discussion about subs being like topping from the bottom, etc. Like subs are not, it's not like in the general society where people think it's not very manly to be a sub, you know. But more broadly, one of the concerns I have about the deepening of patriarchy in long-term BDSM relationships is that there are very concerning, very common cases of use of BDSM as an argument to justify domestic violence. And so, you know, like there was the Attorney General of New York, for instance, who was accused of rape and sexual assault, etc. And his response was to say, it was just rough sex, I'm a BDSM practitioner, etc. And so in court right now, it's a very big issue about strangulation, that a lot of men who are accused of killing or harming their partners claim that it's BDSM, and so we live in a pro-sex society, so it's just kink, and we shouldn't kink shame people, etc. And so there are concerns, and very, in my opinion, valid concerns, that some very patriarchal, violent practices are, so the perpetrators of these practices use the good work that has been done by queer BDSM people and weaponize it in a patriarchal direction. So I'm actually very, like, I'm not against BDSM and really far from this. I'm against the way the progressive BDSM is used to reinforce patriarchal norms and to justify patriarchal violence in certain cases. And I think in that regard, it's very important to distinguish between short-term BDSM relations and long-term BDSM relations. And I think there is much less injustice in short-term BDSM than in long-term BDSM, because long-term BDSM can like merge into daily life in a way that is too dangerous, about like, you know, all these submission contracts of like, she's gonna clean the floor, and also, so when you look up the long-term submission contracts, it's a lot about men controlling the calories intake of their subs so that she's skinny, and deciding how many waxes she gets, and to make sure she's not hairy. So you see like all the super patriarchal norms that are imposed through the form of we're kinky and it's cool. So that's my concern. But I think,
just a pointer on the, you said that being submissive is not seen as less manly in the BDSM community. I just wanted to point out that, yeah, many people tend to have a less sexist way of viewing submission, but I've also heard from people who are involved in the kink community that sometimes, for example, women who are bottoms and want a top will refuse sometimes to play with a male switch, so both submissive and dominant, because they feel it makes them less of a man. So just to complete the thing about how patriarchy can still carry on in BDSM spaces, that is sometimes something that remains too much.
Other questions? Okay, so
maybe we can conclude. Sorry. No, I mean, if there are other questions, I'm happy to respond, but...
Now, as first, I will just ask you to join me in thanking Federica Merenda, who is researcher at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and Carlotta Cossutta, who is researcher here at Scuola Normale, for joining this conversation and incredibly enriching it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Then, of course, thank you to Professor Forti for joining us even online in this conversation. And last but not least, Professor Garcia for accepting our invitation, coming to Pisa, and for this beautiful conversation. Thank you all for being here. And I would also like to thank all the outsourced and insourced staff of the Scuola Normale, Andrea there, who made all the broadcasting possible. And thank you all, and we hope to see you at the next forum event, whenever it will be.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, Simona. Thank you very much.
Ciao. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Where are you going for dinner?
I don't know yet. We're going to talk about food for a while before we decide.
Exactly.
Ciao.
Ciao.
We talk about
fine eating, but we talk about other food, like
Oh, yeah.
dinner and then we say, tomorrow morning, what do we do for breakfast?
Yeah. No, but my husband, he really thinks it's